everyone. I'm Rich Chigai. I'm a partner at Cyber Capital Partners, and I'll be providing a few quick points for today's webinar. Let's quickly review a few items about the webinar functionality. All lines are muted, and we will not use the video option for attendees. This session will be recorded and posted to Cyber Capital Partners website at www.cybercp.com early next week. You'll receive an email when today's recording is available. If you experience any technology issues during the webinar, please send an email to media@cybercp.com. If you experience a significant problem or interruption, please close the webinar and then log back in. And of course, we will survey the audience and solicit feedback during the Q&A session. Let's take a moment to review today's agenda. We have a great webinar today with an overview of the cyber war, the history of cyber in America, where we were at today, the ways industry and government work together, and what business opportunities align with your organization's goals. We aim for the second half of today's event to be an open conversation and invite you to add questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There may also be opportunities for audience members to add their perspectives if time allows. In order to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions during the presentations. There's no need to wait till the end of a presentation to submit questions. We will hold your questions and answer them at the conclusion of the presentations. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Clif Triplett and Jason Gayl. Clif Triplett is a senior industry expert with more than 30 years of proven information technology and cybersecurity experience with the federal government and U.S. corporations, ranging from Fortune 1 to Fortune 200, and across 6 industries to include utilities, oil and gas, manufacturing, aerospace, defense, and high tech. A West Point graduate with a master's in computer science from Boston University, he spent the first decade of his career in the cyber defense of U.S. nuclear command and control systems. Over his post-military career, he has served as CIO for multiple innovative, award-winning technology firms, and as a presidential executive fellow for cybersecurity in the Obama administration. Mr. Triplett is currently executive director for cybersecurity and risk management for A.T. Kearney, consulting with governments and major industries on the changing landscape of technology and cyber threats. Jason Gayl is a friend and business partner of mine, leading Cyber Capital Partners in our efforts to advance U.S. national security, particularly in cybersecurity. Having been a management consultant and investment banker to the U.S. intelligence community's government contractors, Jason's past 17 years have been deeply focused on cybersecurity. As a strategist, business advisor, and investor, Jason has worked in nearly every part of the business of cybersecurity. With that, over to you, Jason.
Hey, thanks, Rich. Really appreciate it. And everybody that's joined us today, thank you for participating. Clif is a frequent speaker on our webinars, and that's because we hold him in such high regard. We've done some work with both Stealth Path and Kearney, and very excited to present today's discussion on the cyber war. Feel free to ask any questions. If time allows, we'll certainly open up the floor to participating members of the audience. Just raise your hand if you would actually like to share something. So starting in 2010, when Richard Clarke published CyberWar, and I got a chance to speak, I got a chance to see him speak. I've read several books on, what is this hypothetical threat of a cyber war? What does that mean? Well, with very little cost, our adversaries could take down our satellite systems, our energy sector, our financial services industries, impacts our ability to defend this country. And this theme has been constant. I just got a chance to see Nicole Perlroth, who wrote This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And her whole focus was the Russians use the Ukrainians as a petri dish on how they're going to attack the Americans. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Got the book right here. Great book. Definitely enjoy the read. Jumping into the U.S. cyber rollout and a bit of the history, and I'm going to invite Clif to talk about this a bit more. What I saw, what I observed was that in 2005, that was the first time that I heard words like information assurance, network security, and it was all coming from the NSA contractors that I was interviewing. And a lot of the work was happening within US Cyber Command, which was a subdivision or a reporting unit to the NSA. And there was a lot of mystery around what is this thing called cybersecurity. In 2010, we saw the rollout of US Cyber Command as its own standalone post. And throughout that 2005 to 2010, what we saw was more and more requirements in the DoD and then the civilian agencies to do high-end cybersecurity work, but nothing really in the industrial space. Until 2010, when we started seeing large enterprise organizations in financial services and healthcare, seeing legislation and regulatory requirements going after them. Around 2012, we saw that move into critical infrastructure. And then in 2015, something really major happened, and that was the regulatory pressure started pushing down on those medium-sized businesses. And what we saw was they had enough resources to go after. They were great targets, and they didn't have enough internal resources to be able to protect themselves. Whereas the enterprise like Bank of America or Kaiser prided themselves on having the internal bench to be able to remediate these problems, or so they thought. So in about 2015, we saw the medium-sized businesses face the same regulatory requirements, but they didn't have the internal staff, and the rise of the cybersecurity vendors, the managed service providers, the managed security solutions providers, the cybersecurity tools and software providers really sprouted up as an industry. And then with the whispers of CMMC starting in about 2019, the back and forth over the past couple of years on what are the teeth of it, we finally see CMMC as that first regulatory requirement that all organizations, all participating businesses within a particular critical infrastructure sector would be required to actually adhere to those same cybersecurity requirements that the government and enterprise and medium businesses were. We're at a really interesting moment now, and I certainly theorize that every single organization within the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, small, medium, and large, are going to have to really focus on shoring up their cybersecurity posture. Cliff, did you want to add anything to this slide?
Yeah, I just want to give some kind of prehistory.
Okay.
Maybe because I've been playing around with this a little bit longer, but back in the 80s, the big concern was how do we better, more effectively manage our nuclear weapons? So there were issues there on how do you control a large fleet of nuclear weapons. You have airborne, you have ground-based, you have the submarines. You have Russia looking like a big threat, China a little less so. And it's all about speed of operation. So we launched some major programs on how do we connect all this stuff up. And now everything gets electronically connected. It's not just people. There's some technologies out there that make it kind of unreliable to just count on voice prints and hearing a voice. So all of a sudden we start really seeing this I think emergence of zero trust kind of concepts. And we've all seen a TV show where you have 2 key controls to launch a weapon and so forth. And we started being really a little paranoid there in building cybersecurity architectures and solutions. But this was really kind of contained into those nuclear control type programs. So this is around the 80s. And then around 84, we start seeing the advent of TCP/IP going across ARPANET and the emergence of the internet, but really in the more again in the military side of the house, whole new set of problems. And now they're worried about, hey, somebody plugging in, and now we're talking about plugging in our NATO allies and how do we maintain security. So we worked on a bunch of technology, but all that technology worked on for security was government unique very expensive, very complex, not well understood, and we saw a broad need for it. And I'm just talking about in the kind of Defense Department. Then here comes 88, around 88, and the world's looking a little bit more crazy, a little bit more automated, again, more reliant on networks and such. And now we start doing some real serious integrated planning with our NATO partners. So we're starting to build new war planning, logistics, rapid deployment force, all this stuff starting to emerge around that time. And then boom, here comes Iraq, 9/11 happens, and the world's off and running, and this stuff is in use. Now the problem is it's kind of all custom government stuff, and the government says this is not going to keep up. We can't do this. We need to start adopting commercial. So all of a sudden they open it up. Security is a little slower, and you can see from the slides shown that it's a little slower. But then something kind of tipped over. They went beyond security going to the market. They went for everything, and what this did is create a whole new set of problems for them. Because now I have all this commercial, uncontrolled, well-published, easily available information on components now in defense. And so this is now creating a new challenge because they've used kind of common technologies. And so more of what they use and how it operates and how it's protected has become known. And most of this energy was around what we would call today traditional business systems. Okay, so this is about, you know, logistics systems, financial systems and such, all important, but this is where a ton of energy went. And we really weren't very comfortable on how you build these systems. The top secret systems, a lot of guidance, a lot of expertise, again, highly custom. But the majority of systems aren't in the top secret classification. The largest piece of the portfolio, and I can't imagine anyone has a portfolio of applications bigger in the US government, have positioned themselves with a bunch of legacy code built on a lot of publicly available information and of extraordinary risk. And where they are today is most government agencies are putting in a program called business transformation, because the legacy infrastructure of applications is currently being assessed at high risk. The second thing that has come online, and Jason talked about the situation over in Afghanistan, Ukraine, is everyone's waking up about, hey, I might be kind of okay in my IT, but I'm majorly exposed in my operational technology, like the infrastructure, and whether that infrastructure is power, gas, the criticals. But, you know, I think we're talking maybe a little bit more about the different industries, but every industry, when you look at them, you think about them, take away the IT systems, okay, the back end office stuff, and you're going to see a huge exposed situation where everyone right now is scrambling to figure out how I get on that. And so that's true in the government, and it's true in the private sector. And I think that brings me to the same page that Jason's on right now.
Yeah, so that gets us exactly to this next slide. You know, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, whether it's the SolarWinds attack, the Oldsmar, the DC police, the Colonial Pipeline, we saw 2021 as a big year of a lot of big attacks that really did marginal damage. In fact, it was the Colonial Pipeline was the first time that I think Americans felt a cyber attack. Everything else, yeah, we've had some inconvenience. I don't really know what to do with a data breach and have my personal ID and my my PPI stolen. That doesn't really seem like a national security threat. But if we figure out how to if our adversaries figure out how to take down our supply chain, both on the U.S. economy and on the ability to respond to war, that weakens the United States very rapidly. And the funny thing is, it's a fairly inexpensive cost. So there's not a lot of appetite for Russia or China there's not a lot of capacity for Iran and North Korea to do a kinetic war against the United States. I think it'd be, assured mutual destruction. But there's a lot of comfort around doing these covert operations, doing these low-cost attacks. It doesn't feel like the same kind of punch when the GPS system goes down or our food supply might be partially impacted. But a large-scale attack could actually very much damage the United States.
Jason, I'd like to just build on that just for a second.
Yeah.
So I gave a talk the other day and was in an exercise with some government parties. And the first thought was, oh, they're going to go after the big obvious stuff like, oh, they're going to go, I see your picture here, you got a power plant, or they're going to go attack that nuclear power plant. Yeah, that's possible. But I got to tell you, they're in a pretty good shape. What I think I was talking about is you got to think about the more indirect, softer targets that have huge impact. Now, Jason, you mentioned supply chain. So I live here in Houston, Texas. We have, I think, the second largest port in the United States, a major, major port. And, if I start thinking about it being a bad guy, an adversary, regardless if I'm a small terrorist guy or I'm a nation state, think about what would happen at the port of Houston if I just attacked the cranes.
Right.
Okay. And I disable the cranes at the port of Houston. Okay. Now, would that be an exciting target? We'd totally screw up our supply chain. It would be a major political embarrassment. It would be highly disruptive. And what do you got to do? Take out a half a dozen cranes, this operational technology. And so as you think about that, again, you have to rethink softer targets. I mean, all you have to do is walk over, get access to, our port, and you probably, or just look on YouTube or something, see what kind of cranes we use and target, half a dozen cranes. And I bet you those same cranes are at our port of LA, and you pretty much wipe us out by hitting our cranes.
Right.
I mean, this is really scary. And, so wherever you are, you need to think about, the indirect attack. And I think people are waking up to indirect attacks. So I'm sure the guy who runs the port of Houston, who's, I know, a very good guy, is worried about these kind of problems. But right now, it's really with a situation like Ukraine, and Ukraine being basically a cyber test bed, that people are going, wait a minute, I am overexposed. And, I'm not necessarily the target of supply chain, but I'm the weak link in the supply chain, and I have to start taking action.
And when I absolutely agree with that. And when we think about what is Russia doing right now, I think a lot of us have questions about like what was the motivation and what's the math on it. But clearly, Russia has been attacking the Ukraine. United States has been supporting the Ukraine cyber efforts, looking to counter the Russian attacks. And partly because we know that while they're attacking the nuclear plants there and they develop the malware and the code appropriate for that type of offensive cyber attack, it makes the United States even more vulnerable. And the reality is, as we look at this, as Clif noted, there are a lot of different ways that we can take down a power plant. There's a lot of different ways that we can take down a port. Our supply chain is particularly vulnerable to an attack of cyber war, and that threat seems to be quite real. In fact, last week or the week before, the United States focused on two different big messages. First came from the White House with the idea of, okay, sorry, I was just seeing a note there from Rich. The first came from President Biden talking about how we need to be ready for a onslaught of cyber attacks. The second one, and it was a bit more ominous, came from DHS CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, where they announced the Shields Up program, telling all industries, particularly the critical infrastructure sectors, to be prepared and ready for an imminent cyber attack.
Just one more on that one, Jason. So I was recently involved in some calls with the country of Australia. And so what you see right here from CISA is now happening in other countries as well. So
Right.
Australia just basically took the same point of view, and where they had critical infrastructure defined pretty much as water, gas, and electricity, said, no, 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 no. There's now, I think they have 11 that they've now dictated are now considered critical infrastructure. And then all the historic requirements for electrical and so forth are now on those entities. And so there's another kind of big acceleration of examination of their capabilities going on in Australia.
And when we look at the challenges in the critical infrastructure sectors, you know, they range, and every organization has its own unique challenge. Every sector has its own unique challenge. You know, there's over 5,000 different police departments that have less than 20 officers, and they have access to all of our databases. They represent vulnerabilities. They're part of the supply chain in the emergency services sector. Funding challenges for those organizations becomes a real problem. As we talked about earlier, the large, medium, small businesses within any of these have different challenges in securing their multiple locations, prioritizing the spend on security over the spend on operations. I think as we look in the asymmetric information in the world of cybersecurity and the businesses of cybersecurity, you know, there are a lot of technologies that are being introduced. There's a lot of workforce that's being introduced that it's really hard to understand whether or not it will materially improve that organization's cyber posture. So the transparency and the ability to measure the efficacy of our cybersecurity posture is weak. You can see that with the insurance industries. They have a hard time doing the underwriting with the organizations. The vendors, they tend to go after the low-hanging fruit. It's hard to build a business in cybersecurity. And so there's a lot that is focused on IT. There's a lot less that's focused on OT, right? And as Cliff and I are going to say many times in this, it's really the industrial control systems, the SCADA networks, the operational technologies, and now the Internet of Things, you know, where a lot of the vulnerabilities really are, where you land and expand and really can take over critical functions of an organization through what seems like a benign access point. Each of these requires a niche, or each of these sectors is a niche, and as a result, needs specialized vendors, specialized training. And so bringing in a cybersecurity analyst that came out of a SOC in the defense industrial base is not necessarily going to get you the skills that you need in critical manufacturing. Certainly the requirements for financial services don't match up with the utilities of water and waste systems. So there's a lot that requires a deep dive in specialization. And no matter which of these industries you're in, it's complex. Cliff, you've been in 6 different of these sectors. You know, do you think the expertise translates well between them? You know, what's your opinion on, you know, what each of them needs?
Well, first, I want to say I think there's 2 layers to this problem. Okay, so the first layer is, and it's not so much the critical manufacturing, but you could look at it that way, as who makes the technology that these industries use, and how do they create security in the products they deliver to these industries? So that's one piece of talent. Okay. Right. And to some degree, that can transfer a little bit. But to your point, the people who are specializing in software-defined radios aren't really going to be the best guys for manufacturing.
Right.
Okay. There's some principles, but that's a big deal. Now we move into the industry itself, and I'm now one of the service people who's going to make food or transact financial transactions, so forth. A whole nother problem. Many of these that I see on the table all are guided by different regulations. Financial services, for example, I've worked in that quite a bit as well. And, you know, it's about fraud, money laundering. Yeah, you got your typical cyber hacking stuff, but there's other things. So there is a huge gap in security talent. So where we see decent coverage, how do I operate some of these tools, these cyber tools in the market? And there's about 3,500 of those things. And there's a lot of people out there who can do that. Knowing where and how to use it in a particular industry is where we have a gap. If you just want to set up, good to go. Unfortunately, I've been to a couple very major companies, one a whole national infrastructure, and they were out there in an agile methodology, deploying technology, like there's no tomorrow. When I sat down and evaluated with the OEM who was putting in that technology, I said, this doesn't feel right to me, what's going on. And they go, yeah, but they're not interested in getting it all set up correctly. They're interested in getting it deployed because that's how they got measured.
Right.
And I said, what's it going to take to get this right? I mean, we had a little discussion. For this one client, it was going to cost them $7 million just in configuration charges, okay, to correct what they had done. And this is because the client, and this applies to, I think, everyone's industries, don't usually have the talent to do the, risk analysis, prioritization, strategy, and architecture of these tools. And when you got 3,500 tools to play with, which ones do I do? And then I have, on the top of everything else, to hook them up, I got to figure out how they interplay to actually give me security capabilities. And again, a major gap in industry talent. So right now, what I see most people suffering with is the complexity the security market has created for these customers. And so they feel, and I don't think always correctly so, that the OEM for which they buy this cyber tool will deploy it and they're going to get the promised land. No, they'll get the technology deployed. They may or may not get benefit from it.
Well, I think you're hitting on something huge there, and that is, SolarWinds, was it ever tested? Or did the market adopt it because they had a really good quality marketing team? And when you're looking at the energy sector, you got a lot of challenges. One of them is you have to be up, right? Uptime is more important than being secure in the operators' minds. Then you've got the next challenge that says, am I trying to fall into compliance, or am I actually trying to secure our posture? And those are two radically different things. You don't tend to get fired for, meeting the minimum compliance requirements. But the reality is, it doesn't take a whole lot to hit those compliance requirements, and you're still radically vulnerable. So there are a lot of challenges. I don't think it's a perfect system. Even, and we'll talk about this more, about the defense and intelligence market, they do it best, but they're not perfect. And, as we go through this, you always have to make the decision, can I improve the posture? Do I know that I'm going to improve the posture? How much is that going to cost me? How many years is that going to cost me? Does it compromise any of my other business objectives? And those are big conversations that need to be had with the CEO and the board. And oftentimes they're being made by the CISO, the CIO, and the CTO, those decisions. And those are folks who might not actually be around, 24 months later. So I think there's a lot that of challenges up ahead here. Do you want to add anything more before we move on?
Yeah, two things. SolarWinds, you talked about they didn't test it. Okay. What was the big failure there was they basically gave SolarWinds, the company, an unvalidated level of trust,
right?
Assumed trust. Okay, so they had a relationship with them, was an assumed trust. So if it comes SolarWinds, it's going to be good. Okay, and if you look at most of the breaches, it's because of an assumed trust. And this is where you start hearing the buzzword. And some of the concept of zero trust is this assumed trust is dangerous. There's just way too much evidence that you need to verify and validate what you get, i.e. test, and verify and validate what you're getting is what you expected. And so you could just see all the companies who worked with SolarWinds who just gave them undeserving trust. The second thing is, as we look at this, we really need to think about where and how we use technology. I just did a review of a company this week, and they went out and bought firewalls, okay, because everyone should buy firewalls. Okay, so that was good. We bought firewalls. They went and bought the latest and greatest firewall. And then I reviewed with them where they put the firewall. Well, they absolutely put that firewall in the wrong place. Had they put it just architecturally in a different place, it would have probably improved their security 1,000%, but they didn't. They will now, but the sales guy sold them a firewall. Everything they ever read was, I got to have one. Okay. Nobody discussed about where I should install it logically. And so this is, again, a very common problem that I've encountered in almost every business I've been into, is they bought some of the right technology, but it was deployed incorrectly, and mostly out of ignorance.
All right, so let's jump to the next section, and we're slightly ahead of schedule, but not too terribly much. And that is, what are the opportunities? And it might seem crass to say, hey, there's opportunity in this crisis of cyber war, but the reality is, when we look at the war spend, Douglas Aircraft Company had 3 different plane lines models prior to World War II. And when the time that World War II ended, they had 45 in production. That's a huge amount that the government spent on military equipment that turned around and became commercial use. If we look at post 9/11, what the United States recognized was that we had a huge interoperability challenge. And so the government spent $6.4 trillion on post 9/11, about $1 trillion of which was on the IT capital expenditure, all that IT refresh. And that money flowed into the Washington, D.C. region. And all of the defense contractors saw their valuation multiples increase. And it became really easy for the large publicly traded to go buy the medium to go buy the small, because money was just flowing into the industry and the investors rushed in. The cyber war is going to have a very material similar impact. Before we got to where we're at today, U.S. or global cybersecurity spend has been about $200 billion. We know that there's going to be another $30 billion associated with CMMC. Biden's executive order, the infrastructure bill, the recovery bill, we're seeing billions of dollars added to that. But when we start thinking about the cyber war, it dwarfs that. And understanding the government contracting world as well as I do, mission critical is where a stable spend occurs, right? So when the U.S. economy shuts down, we keep the lights on at the forts. When there's COVID, we're trying to make sure that we prop up the things that are mission critical, and it's one of the only topics that has bipartisan funding supports. The next major thing to understand is the government is calling for a public-private partnership. That's always a bit clunky. And when you're dealing with 16 different sectors, you're dealing with many different federal agencies. So there is an opportunity for those organizations that can help facilitate that partnership to jump in and prove themselves as thought leaders, as trusted advisors, really helping to facilitate the discussion between industry and government. And that partnership is not just between one hypothetical homogenous industry, but it's really the fragmented small, medium, large. When we talk about energy, we're talking about nuclear power, we're talking about oil and gas, we're talking about electric utilities. Some are multinational and global, some are rural, right? And one-off, and they all represent vulnerabilities into the system. So it requires a lot of work. It requires an investment in time and energy to really build a relationship with not only the Department of Energy, not only the individual, say, Duke Energy, but you also have to form the partnership with the North American Transmission Forum, the Mid-Continental Independent Service Operators, the Tennessee Valley groups. You've got to be an advocate for all of the ecosystem participants in each of those sectors. So there's a lot of work around that. Cliff, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the one thing I want to add is, there's two things I want to talk about. One is, what's driving all this? Effectively, we're at war right now, okay? And we have a 5-front war, okay? We have a current war with criminals, okay? It may not fit the definition of historic wars, but the criminals are out there kicking butt, and they're making billions, and they just see no end to this supply of money because our justice system hasn't kept up with it. Two, we have this low-cost weapon that's easier to execute with bigger impact that the terrorists now see. And there's a whole market out there for terrorists. So we got this terrorist threat that's absolutely growing, and they're just, they don't care about if it gets out of control or any of those things. It doesn't bother them. That's just all bonus for those guys. Then we have two real big players that are really more in that more traditional war type mode, and that's Russia and China. Okay. When I talk to the Australians, they're watching the Russians, but it's all because they think the Chinese are watching the Russians, and it's going to happen over there on their side of the earth too. And there's no question, the US and its NATO allies are looking at both fronts, and that's the more traditional war. But then we have the fifth area, and that is the tier 2 nation states, the Iraq, the Iranians, the North Koreans, some of the Africans. We have a multi-front war, and I think that's why you're seeing new branches of the government forming, huge monies, and most of what Jason's talking about in monies are those that are made public. But
right.
we also know that there's potentially far more monies
on Title
that are
15
not public in this
right.
domain, because this isn't the Clip observation that we have a big 5-front war. I can tell you every government is concerned about the 5-front war right now.
So the government really has a carrot and a stick. And so the stick we've already talked about is the regulations, and that only gets you so far. But the government has a responsibility to, pay for the things that industry can't pay for. And some of that is, can Bank of America subsidize? Well, yeah, they can, but they have a competitive advantage not to subsidize, right? The under-resourced entities within those 16 critical infrastructure sectors, they're barely break-even profit on their operations as it is. Do they have the capital budget to go take out all of their legacy IT, their legacy OT? And in some of these worlds, those legacy OT are 50 years old. And they're not prepared to go do this capital expenditure refresh. So the government is really responsible for stepping up. And I think we're going to see a lot in the tax credits, rebates, and grants for CapEx expenditures. Going back to the energy sector, you can do a rate refresh to go pick up that increased cost, but that takes you 18 months. And there's a political ill will to raising the rates too much, especially in this time of inflation. We're concerned about the US economy. The second is research and development. The government does a great job with that. They do a phenomenal job of spending billions of dollars on research, and I'll talk more about that later on. They don't do a great job of getting that research into the hands of the industrial cyber war defender. The next piece, there is no operator's laboratory for test and evaluation of cybersecurity, and that's a problem. So I fully expect to see the government funding a lot of third-party test and evaluation of critical security measures, whether it's in communications, it's in industrial control systems, it's in protecting any of those sectors. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And then the last, and it's fairly obvious, there's 4 million open cybersecurity jobs before the United States wakes up to the cyber war. There will be probably 8 million positions opened in the next 2 years here, and we just lack the workforce to go do that. Comparing ourselves to our adversaries, the Chinese graduate 1 million students a year that have some concentration on cybersecurity. We need to do a lot better job of that. And the government is starting to put money into workforce development. We see some really great programs throughout the United States. The second component of this is the thesis, and certainly one that I fully buy into. The cyber capabilities and the technologies developed by and for the Defense Department, for the intelligence community, it's superior to the private sector. I say this flippantly, but if you walk RSA, you see technologies that the NSA had 20 years ago. And they're pitched as though they're innovative. And there's a reason for this. It started in the US intelligence community. We have far more budget to go secure those mission critical facilities, and they've been doing it for far longer. Clif talked about well before 2005. My focus has been 2005 and on, and we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars of cleared budget discussed on cybersecurity spend. How much of the classified budget has been there? The R&D that is performed by our 17 national laboratories, and really it's the 10 that focus on cybersecurity, that they leverage US cyber capabilities. They're not going out and doing research on a hunch. They have a customer that's come to them and said, hey, we need this particular solution based off of a problem that most people don't know about. And as a result, they get access to the technologies and the resources of the US government. So the big question here is, how do we take these technologies, these capabilities, these government contractors and the agency, the civilians and the military employees that are fighting the cyber war, how do we get those skills transferred into industry, the critical infrastructure sectors? Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to go back to the fact that we're $4 to $8 million short, okay, on the people.
Yeah, 48 million people short. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I think you're also going to see is big pressure in the product segment, okay, to have more, AI and features like that, so they can almost begin to self-configure and manage themselves. So we have the market of SOAR, the orchestration response to events. Yep. We have the detection is getting more and more challenging. And we're moving to the zero trust model. Behavioral analytics are going to become a big player in the future. And these tools have got to become less complex to operate and not require the cost and skills it takes to do it. And then most of these products that have high costs and skills to implement don't carry the same amount of expertise of how they fit with others in providing a holistic capability. So I think we're going to see a continued pressure for these people who build products to make these products easier to deploy and more self-aware of what's going on in the environment to provide actionable intelligence to those who they serve.
Well, that leads us exactly to this, right? So what are the holistic solutions? It is a war. It's got offense and it's got defense, and the United States is very actively involved in the cyber war on an offensive front. You need to have the ability to run the missions, and doing so, whether it's performed by the three-letter agencies or it's being performed by a cyber criminal, you need to have the clandestine infrastructure. If you're hosting your implants and your exploits on Amazon Web Services, they're going to find it and they're going to shut it down, right? So you need these clandestine infrastructures. You need a test range, and you need it on both sides. You need to be able to do the test and evaluation on the defense, but you also need the test range on the offense. You need to know what the tools are going to do. In our portfolio, we care a lot about the command and control of the toolkits, so the implants, the exploits. You need to have that advanced R&D capability And then the workforce both has to have the skill, and you got to be able to recruit them. On the defensive side, it's more than just, hey, let me go buy one of those 3,500 tools. It's a complete mindset that starts with the management team. And most people don't really understand cybersecurity to begin with, let alone the people on the board, the executive team, the CFO, the CEO, et cetera. The CISO, the CIO, the CTO frequently think they do. And I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but the reality is most people are too busy putting out fires to go keep abreast of the latest trends, the latest advances in cybersecurity. Clif is going to talk a lot more about the zero trust security architecture. I'll hit on the AI-driven technologies, and I'll talk about a couple of our partner organizations. But the reality is the U.S. government has the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Most of cyber is going to be around standardization and automation. And how are you going to do that? Managing the command and control, making it far easier to track compliance and vendor management. So what we see as important but pestering capabilities needed for risk management. It's going to become far more core part of daily operations. And if we can do those activities in an automated way, I think the better. The incident response, it's fragmented. Most people don't know how to do it. You don't deal with a crisis until you're in a crisis. So how do we help? And then the obviously, again, that workforce. And I'll hit one last thing here. I think we really need to have a combination of standardized solutions across that industry and a centralized monitoring capability. I think Israel does it really well in their energy sector, where each organization is responsible for their own security, but there is a centralized monitoring group that provides threat awareness, threat intelligence, and incident response. And the United States, we don't have the funding in place within our justice or DHS to really go help every organization that's dealing with a cybersecurity attack, and that's real problems. So everything that we believe in, it's based off of the standards that as Cliff was talking about, the nuclear weapons, the NIST NICE standards. So how do we build these? How do we bring them to each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors? And you can see this by itself is a complex effort. So there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of opportunity to bring many, many organizations into the fold. As long as we're looking to create that in a collaborative way, we have a good shot of rectifying the situation. Cliff, I'll turn it over to you.
I want to respond to a couple of points. I think one thing is, again, 3,500 plus solutions out there today, rising quickly because there's a lot of money, as Jason talked about, entering this market. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a filter being applied to the 3,500 by each of these sectors, because it is just too complex. And so I don't think we're going to get to one single template per sector, but we're going to have a much more rationalized set. So maybe for a particular industry, it becomes more like 500 instead of 3,500. And that will, that 500 will be different based on which of the 16 sectors are being served. So I think that's one thing that's happening. Another thing Jason touched on is incident response. The problem is in today's world, at the speed at which the sophistication of the attack, incident response in most organizations is too late. Okay, that has to be pushed way to the left. It needs to be incident preparedness and response in a unified process. You need to see it coming, and you need to take the action before it activates. Okay, so you need, you should need to start detecting, if you're familiar with some of the typical deployment models, when the bad guy's out there doing reconnaissance, you need to detect the reconnaissance and shut down that door right then. You can't wait for the exploit. So a lot of companies think they're in a good place, because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you had incident response playbook, and you turned off the power and you're able to restore. That ain't it. And then again, a recent company I worked with, a major corporation you'd all recognize, they have a centralized incident response group, okay? And that's awesome. I said, how many cyber attacks have they dealt with? Well, none. So your first big one's going to be the one they're going to try it out. I mean, that's not going to work for you guys. It's not going to happen. You know, you need something local. Maybe when you're talking about how you're going to communicate to the press, they're going to be an awesome team and resource to you. But you need to start working on incident response and incident preparedness response on cyber today. And you need to make it an everyday event. And the big cultural change I was trying to push to them is, in most organizations, when something goes wrong in a plant, I'm just going to say a manufacturing plant, the first assumption is a piece of equipment has failed. Okay, you need to turn that attitude around. Is we were just under a cyber attack, and a cyber attack took that piece of equipment down. And when you can prove that false, then you can turn it over to ops, not
Right.
in the reverse, which was ops, and we can't figure it. Doesn't look like anything broke, must be a cyber thing. It's too late. It's over. That philosophy is no longer a manageable philosophy. So now I'm going to jump up to the zero trust part. You know, we talked about SolarWinds, and you know, what they did basically there was said, you know, we're going to have an assumed trust to that particular supplier, and assumed trust is what's destroying everybody. Okay, most of the big breaches you see is an assumed trust was extended to someone who probably didn't deserve it. Okay, and they were compromised relatively simply. Okay, they didn't have sophisticated security. They went and found the weak link. It's over here. That firm has assumed trust with something that we're really actually targeting. So you're going to be attacked indirectly in almost every case. I would say 90% are indirect attacks based on a violation of assumed trust. And so assumed trust in zero trust, I really break it down into three parts. What are you doing to authenticate the asset or entity is the entity assumed to be? Okay, and this is really challenging in the OT world. You know, we're all used to password and, you know, maybe a multi-factor, something with the phone or a PIN or whatever. Pressure gauges aren't real good at that. Okay, so how do I assure that that pressure gauge is the pressure gauge that's controlling my plant? And depending on what industry you're in, a pressure gauge or a thermostat can make or break and destroy your plant or cause great harm or destroy a formula, whatever. So you can't use that traditional ID password thing. That ain't going to work. So we need to have new solutions for authentication. Then it becomes authorization. That's a second big thing. How do we manage the authorization? And where we are today, and you may have heard this, is something called privileged account management. And we as a nation, any corporation just about, I haven't really encountered the contrary to this, is overprivileged. You're given an account and you have privileges that you might use. Okay, and then in the privilege, when I've gone to certain organizations and they measure how many people with privileged accounts active in their network in the hundreds or thousands. And you have to ask yourself, why? Okay, and do they really need all the privileges they have active? And do they need those active privileges right now in production? Because most of our cyber attacks are the assumption of a privileged account, and that's how they make changes to your environment and load software. So authorization in terms of what capabilities and functionality are you going to allow that entity to have, that is going to have to take a magnitude of improvement of focus on how we manage authentication. And then the last thing is, so I got this authentication, authorization, and now I'm in the environment. Is my environmental integrity protected? So do I know the bounds of my network? Have I obfuscated visibility to that environment? And there's a whole bunch of other zero trust capabilities. And what I've been working on, and you saw perhaps the name Stealth Path on an earlier slide, I've been working with the Stealth Path organization, consulting with them and the government on what does it mean in terms of zero trust, okay? To too many, it's just a marketing term that everyone uses, okay? But where the government is today, with all the things that you see and have heard so far from Jason and myself, is no. What we need is a capability model. We need to understand what capabilities we must exhibit to operate a zero trust model. So you have NIST out there doing some great work, and they put out together some architectures. And then DISA came out with their zero trust pillars, more architecture, very little capability. And the Defense Department, and I've been working with the United States Army particularly, have said, that's all good, we like it, but what we really need to know is what capability are we going to instantiate with this architecture? And where are we on this journey and capability? So we've been working with organizations, and I think all organizations are struggling with this, is what exactly do we need for our risk profile to protect our most critical assets? Okay, what capabilities do we need, and where are we on that journey? And it is really a lot of work to figure that out on your own. And this is another, I think, evolution of the market that will take place over the next 5 years, is just as we saw with cloud, started out as a big marketing word. And today, I think there's a reasonably good understanding of what cloud means today and how it's segmented and what the capabilities are, and decomposition of products, and they know how to position themselves in a framework. Zero trust is not there, but if you look at guidance coming out of any government, they're saying the word zero trust, okay? And so people are struggling, what does that mean? And I think that basically the big thing is you need to start with the concept that you cannot assume trust of anything, that you are always compromised, and in an always compromised model, how do we mitigate the impact of compromise? Back to you, Jason.
Yep. So, and this is a slide that we don't have to spend a whole lot of time with, but it's part of the problem. Part of the challenge is you need to be able to facilitate conversations across the entire ecosystem, and there are just so many different participants, and many of them have countering motivations. So understanding how to align the technologists, the strategic partners, doing the workforce development and the test and evaluation, those are all really important things for whether it's an emerging cyber technology, it's trying to figure out how to stand up or improve your cyber posture, and you're a member of, any of the critical infrastructure sectors. You need to have reach. And one of the big challenges is understanding who is that trusted partner. How do I gain access? How do I serve as a trusted advisor or a trusted partner to that other part of the ecosystem when it is a field that, ironically, Clif, as you're saying, is filled with zero trust of the participants? So, how do we do that? Cyber Capital Partners, we spend a lot of time building relationships across the ecosystem, and we welcome any time that an organization needs access to another part. We're happy to facilitate that conversation. Clif, I'm going to go back to Kearney and Stealth Path here. You want to add, what's your focus over at Kearney, and where does a large consulting organization, see the landscape up ahead here?
Yeah, so Kearney's a global strategic consulting organization, probably one of the top 6. We tend to focus on governments and Fortune 200 type corporations. And I've been operating globally with both governments and private sector. And I've been working with those people who make components that the critical infrastructure utilizes, and I've been working with the critical infrastructure providers themselves of services. And we're seeing more and more that people's attention, they were thinking about strategy, market entrance. Should I buy this company? Should I buy that company? A lot more are starting to take at least a slight pause, at least, and saying, where am I on cybersecurity? And where is cybersecurity integrated into my larger strategy? And then what's getting probably the most attention and pull is people reevaluating and asking themselves, where are we on our operational technology? Because the operational technology for most of these companies is where the money's made. And all of a sudden they're realizing from what they read and their CISOs are talking to them is, we're exposed. Now, unfortunately, when they built their IT and security group, they built them and funded them to do traditional IT, Windows operating systems, Linux, and whatever. They don't understand the OT environment. And there's been historically silos in most companies, and it's rare when that silo doesn't exist, between the IT world and the OT world. And the OT world has also struggled in being able to articulate the problem and the business case to address it. And so they've been basically starved on investment to upgrade their technology to the latest. So a lot of these people, if you want to look at most of the IT shops, very current on Windows and Linux and things like that. OT shop, I just went to a company, they're still on XP. Right. Very scary. Okay. And this is a company, like I said, that's, you would all be shocked. But it's for the exact same reason. They don't have an IT team. They don't have a cyber team. And now there's an awakening and presentations will be presented to the board that this is no longer probably survivable in this 5-front war, which they are likely to be exposed to. So this to me, I think lines up very much with what you were saying before, Jason, about the spend and the interest and so forth. But I think one of the things that the war in Ukraine has done is it brought cybersecurity and the international threat to the light. And Stealth Path here is where we really are looking at zero trust concepts and really moving to behavioral analytics of the behavior of the OT environment. And so there's a strategic alliance between Kearney and Stealth Path. Kearney at the strategic level, whether it's advising countries or Fortune 200, and then as they move into the security strategy, all of them are looking at what does zero trust mean to us? Where should we be on that journey? Where are we on that journey? Help us get on a journey towards advanced security before we are attacked of a serious nature that takes away the wealth our company currently represents.
All right, and I'm going to jump into a little bit about Cyber Capital Partners and what are we investing in. We were really fortunate to make our first major acquisition on December 31st of last year, and we bought two companies, Point3 Security and their sister business, Point3 Federal, which got rebranded to P3F at some point. So P3F is our cybersecurity CyberWar services platform, and we look to do sponsored R&D. We do mission support. We do nation state level exploitability testing, and I can talk a bit more about that. We do test and evaluation and workforce development, and you can see there's a strong alignment with where we think the government's going to spend money and where we've prioritized our investment dollars. In our CyberWar Technologies Accelerator, in our venture studioing activity, we've got a lot of really great activity. Escalate and Jupiter, we're really excited about. Those are part of the Point3 portfolio. Escalate is a training platform. It's a skills assessment. We took two gentlemen who spent their time within a particular fort learning how to do mission support, how to run large implants and listening post exercises. And Jupiter itself is a command and control platform. We utilize it for test and evaluation of client environments, right? And so that nation state level exploitability testing versus pen testing, I don't really care too much about whether or not you can break into my website. I care about how would Russia, how would China break into and take control over my nuclear power plants. With Escalate, that product set is really interesting, and that's all around when the Pentagon is looking to train cyber operators. Historically, they did so through rote memorization, paper-based exercises. The Pentagon came to the Point 3 team and had them observe what their training challenges were. And Evan Dornbush and John Rigney, the founders of Point 3, built out a cyber range and eventually 166 cyber challenges, because you need to do computer-based training if you're going to have computer operators. And basically Escalade is a cyber simulator, just like a flight simulator training pilots. On the Department of Energy side, we have a contract with the U.S. Department of Energy to help commercialize cyber technologies from the national laboratories. And what we do there is showcase those technologies. We vet them down. We look to understand what is the market appetite for them. And then we develop the messaging so that we can do a virtual showcase and in-person showcases of those technologies, where we look to solicit the input from the ecosystem, whether those are strategic partners, their potential investors, their customers. And all that says, okay, from the national lab, they developed this great proof of concept technology that either the U.S. Department of Defense, intelligence community, Homeland Security made a request for, or the energy sector made a request for. And so what that means is you've got a real problem that DOE has figured out a initial solution for, but they get stuck on the shelf because the national laboratories aren't meant as a cybersecurity accelerator. So as part of our contract with DOE, we take those technologies. There's about 250 advanced R&D programs that have reached proof of concept across 10 cyber labs. We vet those down, we showcase them to our audience, and then based off of how the audience reacts to that technology, we'll go and interview the audience members or similar audience members, similar organizations that look like the audience members, and determine, do we have market demand? Are there organizations that want to make the investments because they believe in the opportunity? Are there organizations that want to make the partnership investment, meaning are they going to take the technology forward with their own technology that they bring, their own customer set? And we develop those into new companies licensing the technologies from the national labs. And then on the right here are the organizations like Stealth Path, and I was mentioning, artificial intelligence-driven incident response, which is Velocity and Group of Solace. All of these organizations over here, we work with, we collaborate with, and help bring them to market so that our solution set is enhanced and so that there's a common integration. I'm not going to go through too much time on this. We only have another 6 minutes before we get to Q&A.
Jason, I just want to say one thing real quick on that last slide.
Yeah.
I want to just that middle column there, so to speak, with Department of Energy and corporate.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Studio. This is really where we can gain market intelligence. Okay. So here's where you can see the demand, not always the money, but you can see the problem, because these are the thought leaders in critical infrastructure, and they're identifying what the challenges are and which challenges have to be prioritized and which ones executed. So if you want kind of advanced notice of what's coming to the market, it's this center column here that really gives us that intelligence to know how to invest and where to take these products.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you do a lot of work with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're solving the problems on the hydroelectric dams. They're bringing those solutions that the government is spending lots of energy and resources on. Bringing them to market really requires a whole lot of steps involved. And I don't mean this in a too terribly of a disparaging way, but most of the cybersecurity technologists that I know have spent 20 years in a SCIF, or they have, really figured out how to develop a state-of-the-art technology. And just like any other form of brilliance, they've got a strength that other people don't possess, but they don't have the business acumen or the sales expertise or the access to the customers. And we really think that those are critical functions that somehow Series A investors or later round investors are expecting that cyber entrepreneur to have. Our philosophy is quite different. We think take the technologies once they reach proof of concept, whether it's with the Army Corps of Engineers or it's with the Department of Energy. We're also a U.S. Department of Defense trusted capital provider, which means that we see a lot of military technologies that have also reached proof of concept that haven't reached market adoption yet. And we work with them to bring them through that whole process. So, Clif, you're absolutely right on that Army Corps piece. When we talk about what is the venture studioing and what are the opportunities, we're soliciting, as part of today's conversation, but Cyber Capital Partners is always soliciting partners, investors, customers who are willing to go through the test and evaluation, the customer requirements, the beta testing. How do you bring that, technology readiness level 4 technology, which just means it's gotten a proof of concept, it was successfully tested, but it's not at an MVP, it's not market ready. How do you go through all of that work? And as you can see here, what we want to do is build out a high fidelity range so that we can do test and evaluation of the industrial control systems before we go introduce a new cyber solution into their production environment. And the more that we integrate artificial intelligence into that, where we're doing it on both the offensive and defensive side, the more we're able to establish a base level of efficacy and measure the improved cyber efficacy by the introduction of a new software, a new solution, a new firewall, as Clif was mentioning. Wi-Fi, that's a really cool project, Idaho National Laboratories. How do you identify the signal threats? And the way that we take down technologies, the way that we gain access, yes, it could be the drop thumb drive, but it can also be an unknown signal that is picking up the Wi-Fi signal, or figuring out how to jam the operations, and the signal processing. The next piece, and Clif talked about this before, the OT environment and the IT environment, those are two critical core functions of any industrial control system-based organization, but there tends to be a lot of stovepiping between the two, and that is catastrophic. It can be certainly catastrophic in a active attack, and if the cyber team, the IT team, don't really understand what's going on in the OT environment, you can have several negative responses. One is you can take down the production. And when uptime is such a critical factor, that is problematic by itself. Two, you can do dangerous things that harm the operators. And so if there's not clear communication between, then you've got these additional risks that really show up during an incident. So we're developing out, based off of Pacific Northwest's OT visualization dashboard, we're creating an industrial control systems command and control platform. I've got a long line of things we want to do with that, but part of what we want to do is build that into as a complement to the test and evaluation range, because if you're doing continuous breach and attack simulation, Amazon Web Services is constantly attacking their own network. If you do that same kind of breach and attack simulation, then your team is better prepared when the Russians, when the Chinese, when the Iranians, North Koreans, Iraqis are doing it, and you have a much better response. One of the awesome technologies, definitely at a TRL 4, is Mastery, and that is how does this one device, if this device goes down, how many downstream devices does it take down? And if you can understand the downstream impacts before the event occurs, then you can minimize the disruption to operations because you can do that modeling and simulation on a continuous basis. And if something new happens and an incident occurs, you've got that live environment that you can test before you go make a change and understand, if I turn off this switch, what are the things, what are the other things that are going to fall?
Jason, real quick on that one. The one other real value to that is if you understand the correlation of one device to the others, it can really help you with your limited security budget, figure out where best to focus it.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got a limited budget, what devices are you going to harden? What are the critical devices, right?
And this kind of visibility is of extreme value for that.
Yep. And then the last piece here, this is a risk management framework for the nuclear power industry. However, we intend to take it to the 16 critical infrastructure sectors and combine it into Escalate so that we can do both the risk management and the sector-specific workforce training and skill assessment platform. So those are the things that Cyber Capital Partners is heavily focused on, whether it's on the services side or the technologies. And then on the prior slide, we've got the working relationships with a bunch of entrepreneur-led cybersecurity startups where we partner with them to bring them into the customer sets. And whether you want to talk on how can we collaborate on our portfolio, the Department of Energy or the Army Corps of Engineers or the DoD Trusted Capital Marketplace, or any of these standalone organizations, we welcome that conversation. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A section. Ask the questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to stop sharing the slides here, and that way I can take a look at the Q&A without sharing too much. And then Rich, Clif, and I are going to see if we can't find pathways to invite audience members to participate in the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but it's now open discussion, and I'm going to take a look. All right,
so audience members, now press the Q&A button down at the bottom. Ask your questions in that window. And if you are interested in joining the discussion when it's time to address your question, just use the raise hand button and I'll enable your audio.
And we'll give a few moments here.
And in the meantime, I'm going to pop up a poll so you can provide your feedback on this session.
And I'm certainly, there we go, the poll is up. If you are interested in talking and sharing your thoughts, I recommend hitting the little button that says raise hand and sending the panelists a little note. So I'll kind of kick off the questions, Clif, and I think this is one of fairness. At some point you go, man, the challenge is too hard. We spent as an organization, let's say $100 million credit union, you're making $4 million a year. You've got, call it a $500,000 annual budget on IT. How much more do we have to spend before, we go and can ascertain that we're in a better position than some other targets? So, if there's an owner of a business, how do you sit down with them and talk about, where do you get to from here?
What I have found is that most people start with the opinion, look, to be secure, I got to spend a lot of money, and I don't have it. So kind of a defeatist attitude. So I'm just take my risk. Okay. But then at some point in time, they said, oh, we got to do that. I'm going to spend all this money. And then usually this is when, you know, a big company would say, let's go get a second opinion because I'm the CEO or the board and I'm not comfortable spending this much money without a second opinion. I go take a look at the situation. My guidance to them and my guidance to the audience and basically any company is before you go spend a lot of money on some new stuff, I always promote a strategy I refer to as free first. Okay. How are we spending the current dollar? What technologies do we already have that could be employed in a better way to better secure the organization? And I found that in most cases, most companies could probably improve security almost 100%, if not more, by just making, sometimes it's a policy decision, very simple things. When I was at General Motors, we made huge security advancements with electrical tape. Okay, I bought some colored electrical tape and we put it on certain cables. And I said, if this happens, pull this cable. Okay, pull the green cable. Okay, I can't tell you how significantly that improved our security, how many plants were protected with electrical tape. Okay, and I just happened to buy different color electrical tape and asked everybody to buy the same 5 colors of electrical tape. So there are many, many things one can do to dramatically improve their security. And then when it comes to now, I only have so many dollars, I think was really important. And again, a failure I see in many companies is really identifying what is the crown jewels. Okay, again, I went to a very large operation, very large. The building itself I was looking at was under, I think, 8 acres of roof. Okay, but there were about 4 servers in there, 4 Windows machines that were the crown jewels. And I said, don't worry about the 8 acres. Protect these 4 boxes, okay? And you'll go up 1,000%. And I said, here's 3, upgrade the operating system, put a firewall around them, blah, blah, blah. Maybe $25,000, okay, for something that was probably at least a couple $100 million a year operation. And I said, how can you afford not to do this? Okay. Right. But the problem was they thought, well, we're so big, it's so expensive, it's so complex, we can't take it on. But finally with Ukraine, they said, we better at least go look. And there's some very low cost opportunities. So you may not get where NSA is or some of the other, Intel operations, but you could probably still double or triple your security capability and reduce your risk such that when it happens, not only the problem you have when it happens is you're compromised, but then all too often it becomes public. And then you get crucified for not have taken prudent actions. And so prudent bar right now is not too high. And most companies can do it for low cost.
It's funny. I asked the question and I didn't even think about the answer when I asked it. But the common advice that I give to financial services organizations or energy or DoD industrial base participants, go to the vendors who are matching your criteria. Meaning, if you're going to go to a managed service provider, make sure that they've built their MSP to align with what your needs are. There are a lot of MSPs, managed service providers, that have, $1 million in revenue and 25 different types of clients. I think that's a disaster waiting to happen. Instead, if you focus, and I'm going to use that $100 million credit union, if you focus on a firm like Ongoing Operations that only works with credit unions of that $100 to $1 billion size, then their best practices, their standard approach is going to have a lot more security built into it already, as opposed to organizations that are trying to build out bespoke deployments for every single client. The same goes with your managed security solutions providers. I think the same goes for every part of the cyber ecosystem. You want to have parties that really understand your problem. And if you're part of any of these 16 critical infrastructure sectors, you have a challenge, and that's there's not a lot of incumbent vendors. So what's one of the opportunities? The audience here, the cybersecurity marketplace, has the real opportunity to specialize, to dive deep, make that investment, and become a leader in creating and improving the solution. For me, the strategy that Cyber Capital Partners takes is the medium size of a critical infrastructure sector is your best starting point. And that's because they have budget to remediate, but they don't have budget to solve it on their own. And if you get 20, 30, 40 of the same type of organization to collaborate, then you can create a standardized solution that the small in the industry can adopt as well. And so I think the long-term solution goes from being, single deployments, multiple single deployments that look the same, to a standardized infrastructure, whether it's secure communications or it's software that was developed and security tools that were developed that can be integrated into the communications platform that all small businesses within that organization have access to as well. All right, so that was question one. There are a couple questions that are specific to Cyber Capital Partners, and I'll make those very quick answer. One is, when do we make our investments? We think there's a massive gap between proof of concept and Series A, Series B. And we think many of the flaws that the market perpetuates are because the cyber investors are looking for folks who know how to go sell a cyber capability, not folks who have solved a problem. And as we talked about before, there's that big gap between those who have a brilliant mind and create an awesome technology, and those who can really navigate the halls of the conference center, can make a compelling pitch. We think our team addresses that really well. The second question that goes hand in hand with that is to elaborate on the DoD Trusted Capital Marketplace. And that's an easy Google, but I'll add some more to this. One of our largest concerns is, how do you prevent foreign investments in U.S. cyber, U.S. military technologies? It's not enough to have a CFIUS board. You need to make sure that the folks who have their hands in the cookie jar have the U.S. national security motivation. So as a result, Katie Harrington created the U.S. Department of Defense Trusted Capital Marketplace, where emerging capabilities providers can apply to have their technologies listed, and U.S. investors that can evidence that their capital is coming from U.S. sources can apply. And it's not as rigorous as a TS/SCI full scope poly, but it's more than a TS. And so Cyber Capital Partners went through that process. And as a result, we get access to all of the emerging technologies there. And so I'll jump off of that topic quickly here. The next on here, so here's one I don't really fully know the answer myself. How is the use of fintech as a means of conducting offensive operations against adversarial nations and their key personnel being viewed in the national security community? And I don't have enough visibility specifically on the use of fintech. I do have a lot of use of AI, quantum, and blockchain NFT capabilities, and I can talk more about that. But specifically fintech, that's not one that I have a deep enough expertise. Do you, Clif?
No.
Okay.
Probably the ones you named, I could talk more to as well.
Well, let's pivot to that, because I think that is an important part. And I think the quantum, the AI, and the blockchain represent ancillary and complementary technologies that need to be added, right? So The United States, Russia, China, we're in this race for quantum computing dominance, and whoever wins that by 2030 supposedly is going to have global domination for the next 70 plus years. And so, in fact, I tend to think that the cyber war, or the Russian war with the Ukraine, is actually the effort of Russia to destabilize our lead in quantum and AI and other capabilities. The way that we deal with it is we participate with quantum researchers throughout the United States. Q-Secure, American Binary are a couple that we work with that we like a whole lot. And any of our cyber research projects, we look to bring them into. And the reason for that is not only are we going to need to be ready for, the April 14th, 2030 date that, quantum is going to be ubiquitous and is going to be able to break standard encryption. But there's this whole entire transition from how do we build quantum adjacent technologies now that aren't going to require rip and replace within 7 years? How do we build those hybrid communication networks? How do we build those legacy IT, quantum computing IT networks to work together? So a very core part of what we do is anytime we like a technology from the national lab, we bring it to our quantum teams, we bring them to our AI teams, we bring them to the OEMs of each of the sectors, and we tend to work with the cloud service providers like Greg Pepis over at Amazon Web Services to really make sure we're understanding where that technology is going to be able to future-proof and be able to last more than 2-3 years, because the lifespan of a cyber technology can be awfully short. So we look to stretch that out as long as possible, and building it into next-gen capabilities is a key part of that. All right, I've rambled on a bit there. Cliff, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I think the last point you made was, I think, the important one. I've been designing secure systems for a long time. I designed some in the late 80s. They're still operational and quite secure today. But how's that done? It's recognizing things that are likely to come, may or may not come. But you got to look, like you're talking about, at least 10 years in the future if you can, and say, how do I build a strategy today that would defeat that? Okay. Now, so for example, quantum, you talked about, look, everybody believes one of the big things quantum's going to do is going to disrupt encryption. Therefore, telecommunications is going to be untrusted. So how do I build a system in an untrusted network? Okay. And where you might as well be broadcasting in the clear. Okay,
right.
So what do I do? And this is where things like zero trust come to be, because that's basically the assumption of zero trust. So it becomes more about architecture now. How do I architect a solution that isn't reliant on things like encryption or telecom, and I don't have these assumed, trust relationships? And so this is, again, where we have probably the greatest shortfall in talent. And this is where I think we're going to see the innovation come from, is when that talent that does exist gets together and comes up with these patterns of technology and architecture that begins to prepare for the future. I don't think they're out there yet. I haven't seen them. I mean, like you said, I worked on the government stuff, decades ago and recently, but the stuff I worked on decades ago, some of that I still haven't seen out here. Mm-hmm. So the other thing I think it's exciting about Capital Partners and the kind of work you do is it generally the incubator is the government, and it may not come out for 10, 20 years. But I can tell you, for example, when I was in there, I was one of the early users of TCP/IP. When I got in the private sector, I'm one of the very first guys who rolled out TCP/IP in the commercial sector. And it allowed me to be highly successful and helped those companies I worked with to be highly successful. You'd recognize them all. But a lot of it was because the insight I had from my classified government work, and I think Capital Partners has the same thing. So they have probably greater insight of what is likely to be successful in the future.
So there's a question in here. where do data fabric platforms for data protection, where does that fit within the zero trust and the assumed trust breakdown?
It's really, I would really talk about it in the sense of masking. I'm sure you've probably heard of the term of masking. It's where you take data and you don't make it all visible. So in zero trust, you really want to restrict the access and functionality because you don't want to expose any more than you have to give. And so with that type of fabric encryption, you can very much guarantee and limit the access you grant is no more than is required. And right now what happens is this is an area where way too much data and information is exposed, where unintended consequences of information leakage and things happen. And so having the appropriate fabric, again, I just talked to a company and I said, if you're going to invest in encryption right now, the most important place for you to encrypt right now is your data fabric.
It's you hit on two things there. One is the encryption, and I think one of the things I'm most scared about long term is the amount of information that's being captured now that's encrypted, and it's going to be broken, in 2030 or longer. It creates this much easier theft of U.S. intellectual property, and I'd like to see us really get our encryption at that post-quantum level. But the second piece there that you hit on was the obfuscation. And I think that's one of the things we didn't have on the holistic solutions, and I didn't actually include it in our pipeline of deal flow. But one of the tools that we think is really awesome is called Hades out of Sandia National Laboratories. And we showcased it a couple of years ago here. And the idea is you want to build out environments that look real. And the more that you can build out those environments and have thousands of simultaneous dummy environments, the more it is hard to find the real. The idea, and I was just talking with a guy today, Emerson, who was talking about, secret sharing and taking data fields, breaking them apart, storing them on multiple clouds, storing them in multiple different encryptions, so that if you capture any piece of it, you're only seeing a small snippet, and it's almost IP frequency hopping, right? And so how do you obfuscate the data? I took a lesson from, credit unions of the intelligence community who, bring in non-intelligence community members to hide the fact that their rosters are filled with, highly desired targets within three-letter agencies. So that whole idea of how do you hide in plain sight, how do you obfuscate the attack surface? That seems to be a huge part of the solution that I think we're going to see become the standard over the next several years here.
Yeah, I think I like what you said. The only thing I would put in there, in addition to for sensitive information, you said partition it, compartmentalize it, spread it, but also put it on diverse architectures so that you make it as challenging as possible. You have to crack multiple locations, which you don't even know what they are. You have to crack multiple technologies, which you don't know what they are. And then you have the key that puts us together in multiple places, and you have multiple keys, and they're rotating. So the more, so to speak, secret sauce you can put in that's moving, the better. Or you absolutely have to have something like quantum computing to hack it. Plus, you have to compromise virtually all the accounts. And then the only way to hack it is quantum. But the more diversity you put into it, there are solutions that you should probably start thinking about. This is the way the world's going to be in 10 years. Start thinking about that now. Putting them all in one Oracle database and the associations in the Oracle database, you might as well just give it away.
Yeah, absolutely there. So we have another question that's come in. I'm not quite sure I fully understand it, so I'm going to work through it here. Is there development in process to train artificial intelligence systems to instrument varying depths of activities that veritably identify the elements of the fintech stack of individual or entity across an adversarial nation and its high value targets, where analytics would be able to determine the best strategies to locally crumble a fintech status with a precision hit or a solitary hit that would detonate or crash a standing or status akin to crumbling of the Jenga stack. I'm not quite sure what the question is asking there. Does that read to you, Clif?
Yeah, I'm going to make my interpretation of what does it say.
Okay.
It says, can we crawl a nation state, a nation environment, and take a look at how the communications are, and based on pattern recognition, determine, the critical assets, and then understanding the behavior of that critical asset, potentially identify its vulnerability through potential, vulnerability scanning. So, almost with an AI system, just turn it loose, let it crawl, find the critical assets, find the weak links, and then report back.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's certainly, bots that are built to go find the vulnerabilities and the exploitabilities within organizations. And, I don't know that I can add a whole lot more value to that, but there's a world of, tradecraft where you take all of the defenses that we're talking about and, all the technologies for defensive postures and how do you apply them to the offensive. And, I think what Clif and I are really focused on in our own respective businesses is, how do we best prepare the country for this cyber war? How do we respond quickly? It looks like it's an overwhelming problem. And to some extent it is, but, I think more and more it tends to replicate what the health community is. And, 100 years ago, we weren't really solving health problems too particularly well. And we've created this national, an international effort to conquer science. I don't think it's going to take us 100 years. I think there is this, probably 5-step process that says, how do we take care of the biggest problems in the most standardized ways? How do we then automate them? How do we drive it into artificial intelligence? How do we then build it into quantum-based artificial intelligence? And then how do we build it into an infrastructure that all ecosystem participants can subscribe to? So
back to that earlier question about zero trust, one of the other characteristics of zero trust is independent verification, watchdog systems. So, if you go into all the automation, it's kind of scary. We've seen all the scary stuff on that. But if you create a series or a pack of watchdogs that are watching over this to give you that earlier detection and vote basically the bad party off the island who's been compromised and can do it at quantum speed, then you have a chance of survival. And again, these are the kind of thoughts we have to start generating today in preparation for what's coming.
So if anybody has any unanswered questions, feel free to put them into the chat here.
There is one in the chat, I believe. I don't know if you've answered that one. It says quantum computing.
Yeah.
Given the latest White House memo on this subject, your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts, and we hit on quantum a little bit. Greg Pepis, AWS, love the guy, and he's a strategic advisor to Cyber Capital Partners, so we do a lot of work together. He and I were down at South by Southwest, and AWS hosted a track at Capital Factory, which is another military technology accelerator. And he put together a quantum all-day session, and that was just absolutely fascinating. I will say my brain hurt really bad afterwards, right? So it's not for the faint of heart. There are multiple components of quantum, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all. One is the concept of the supercomputer, and where are we going to get into the speed at which we can process. The second is secure communications and quantum communications. which seems to be a lot less theoretical and a lot more, market ready in the next couple of years here. And then the third is quantum encryption and post-quantum encryption. And I think all of those play a really important role in cybersecurity. Much the same way, and this is probably a weak analogy, but much the same way that we went from 8 tracks to tapes to CDs to digital, we're going to go from the historical ways of cybersecurity, the current means, which I think are fragmented and at best, weak. We're going to get to a spot where we're on this hybrid domain, and maybe by 2040, 2050, quantum computing becomes the standard. It's entirely possible that there is some other physics-based computing that becomes the standard by then as well. So as we go through this, I look at quantum, the various ranges or the various types of capabilities as a very important domain to build the technologies that we're building today. And keep in mind that we're going to build them onto the quantum world in the very near future here. And we have to be willing to do that continuous refresh and reevaluation of our cyber posture, because what is right today is going to very quickly be stale tomorrow. Clif, did you?
Yeah, I just think, look, there's some foundational concepts today that are in play, like frequency hopping. Port hopping, a few things like that, we're going to see, and sometimes you have to make an assumption, but I think it's a safe assumption that with quantum computing, we're going to see the speed of frequency hopping and port hopping and maybe even container hopping and things like that going right along with the encryption. And so the more forms of hopping, and if you have a similar engine, maybe not the best engine, but the more engines you put on it, the more challenging it is for the one big bad boy to catch you. But if you haven't started thinking about those kind of architectures and variabilities in your system today, where you could apply additional speed, compute speed to it, then you're going to be where unfortunately, most of our government, at least the executive branch is, and basically have to consider redoing the entire portfolio of applications. And that is just one horrendous mountain to climb.
Yep. So, I look at where we're at. It first and foremost, it kind of surprised me that COVID hit so hard, right? Like when it happened, I thought to myself, oh, we're never going to see a global pandemic the way that the 1918 Spanish flu was. And we go, oh, well, I guess we are. And it's pretty easy for me now to go, oh, right, well, the concept of World War III probably isn't the same as the, logical transition from 1 to 2 was. I think cyber war is here to stay for a long time. And, one, I think it's fascinating to see how quickly the whole entire trend of globalization got taken down. And then 2, I think it's vitally important that the United States does everything it can to bring its supply chain back to adjacent soil or U.S. soil, and in the same exact manner, whether we're talking about the software supply chain or we're talking about the national security supply chain, it's extremely vital that we figure out how to bring our suppliers closer to us, closer to the same standard of compliance, of security compliance. So altogether, we're here for a really big change. And I think that really big change is going to look a lot like, World War II with the war bonds and, everybody participating on a national level in the national defense. There are 2 questions that popped in here, both from Andrew. How about cloud RAID adoption by commercial sector at beyond the RAID 12-18 split locations count? And I think we're going back to that data fabric question. And this is certainly one that I raise my hand and go, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully appreciate the question. It's my problem.
Andrew, if you want to raise your hand, Rich can let you in, and you can ask the question live if you'd like. Here's Andrew.
All right, go ahead,
Oh,
Andrew.
I'm particularly intrigued about the discussion of spread spectrum, which is really a process kind of thing of hopping the frequency for radio, usually traditionally used in high security military communications. But there's a parallel in the space of data whereby data is split across multiple locations. Now, originally this has been used for resilience purposes with RAID drives locally.
Yep.
But the up and coming way to do this is to actually implement RAID across locations. It's very, very difficult to do. Government has done it for critical things, but traditionally it's been about 100 million of expense to manage the integration issues. It's coming to the commercial space. It first arrived in the media world, where you need it for loading CDNs for the next person looking at a new piece of content, but it's going to get applied in the space of commercial data protection very soon. The 100 million jump has been the huge problem, and in the commercial world, it's actually been even more expensive. The limit in the commercial world had been the RAID controller cost for high performance. Typically they had 4 interfaces, so that tended to limit the drive count locally to 12 to 18. In the commercial world, in the government world, they could jump over that by just spending the money. But now the thing that's critically changed is you can do network attached drives where you get rid of the operating system, you get rid of all the latency issues, and you can manage the latency across a wide area network. And it's that networking part that's so challenging to solve. But once you get through that with software defined stacks, you can actually implement high stripe count RAID on the wide area. And that seems to be the panacea for solving many of the challenges of zero trust, for doing like spread spectrum rather than by frequency hopping. You're actually hiding bits of your data in the RAID segments across locations. And this can be done at much higher than the 12 to 18 stripe count of the local limit for RAID. And this seems to be the way forward. I'm curious about both of your reactions to how far off this is in the commercial marketplace rather than the government market space, where the first events of these sorts of things were done actually in around about 1998. I worked with them in the early 2000 period.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you look at a company like Teradata,
Mm-hmm.
they're well equipped to take on this kind of challenge. Now, will they? I don't know, but the technology's kind of out there to go in pretty large scale. They just don't really do the distribution for security kind of purposes. They do it for performance. So I think as we move, we're going to see performance and security collide here, and it's going to be a positive thing. But I also think it's going to be a collection of these type approaches. So you talked about one, I think port hopping, processing hopping, container hopping, all these kind of things are going to take place. So the larger concept of obfuscation, of not even knowing where the target is and needing a supercomputer just to find the target, is where I think we're heading in zero trust.
So I'm going to say a statement here, Andrew, and that is, I don't have enough intimacy, with the RAID. However, I welcome a conversation. Everything that we do is, scratch and sniff. And does this actually, make sense? And is there an opportunity there? And if there is, then we'll go facilitate a few other conversations and figure out if that does it still make sense. We're always looking for what are the creative ways to solve major problems in cybersecurity? And if that does it, we have the communications experts who we can bring the conversation to. The other part of this is when you talk about something that's $100 million, well, that's far beyond the scope of what we would ever look to allocate capital to. And only because there's so much of the market that is around, the math says when you get to Series A, you're looking to raise 5 to 10 million. When you get to Series B or Series C, you're looking to get to that $50 million range. So you need to have a really, really strong depth in order to get the folks understanding why you need $100 million to go, deploy that solution. That said, I know fully, and I can get into a concern about monopolistic powers of our tech industry, but it is quite clear that the largest players are taking much, much larger risks on building out billion-dollar facilities or building out capabilities that require a massive lift, and there could be appetite for it. So, more than happy to set up a conversation with you, Andrew, and definitely appreciate the question.
Great. Most look forward to that. And thank you both for your spectacular presentation. Excellent summary of the current state of cyber warfare.
Well, definitely appreciated. All right, so we seem to be out of questions, and we also seem to be out of time. Cliff, is there anything?
We do have one more hand raised if you want to address it.
Okay,
This is Michael Stoltz.
Oh, bring Michael up. Michael, how are you? And you're on mute. There you go.
Still don't hear you, Michael.
Trying. He's got permission to talk.
You might have to take Andrew off of permission.
Take him off of permission.
Because it shows Andrew's hand is up and it's taking it off of Michael. There you go. Michael, how are you?
Hey, doing great. Thank you. I actually accidentally hit that button. Appreciate the presentation today. It was awesome. And I wanted to circle back with you and Clif on a conversation and, pursue a strategic partnership going forward. And really appreciate it. It was really worthwhile. And I shared it with other folks and they're listening in as well. Thanks.
So for the audience, Michael Stoltz is out in Arizona and he does some work with the local universities there. And also, like Cyber Capital Partners, takes technologies developed in the universities and in the national laboratories, develops CRADA agreements and brings them into both the defense and the energy sector. And so it's always good to hear his voice. All right, so we're at time. Cliff, is there anything else you'd like to wrap up with?
No, I just thought it was a wonderful session. I think this is just going to continue to be more exciting as time goes on. I do believe Russia is also, we talked about the cyber range concept that Cyber Capital Partners represents. Unfortunately, today, I also believe Ukraine today is a cyber range. For many people to demonstrate